expanding on the previous scene that's just being worked on, so starting with clone placement underscore 003 underscore water, what we're going to do is take a look at an animated effect where we're going to grow all of these plants starting from one end of the terrain to the other. So in other words, there being no plants whatsoever in the scene, no clones, and then starting from one end, we could also end up using a shape or controlling it in different ways. I'm going to choose just to use just kind of a plane starting from one end of the terrain and moving it across, and not only removing or adding objects while doing so, but also changing their size over time. So for this, one of the easiest things to do is setting up a plane effector. And actually what I'm going to do is select all of our cloner objects first and add the plane effector, so it's automatically part of all of the lists in the effector lists. We're going to go to parameter and we're going to turn off the position, and we want to now set this up to be Falloff of linear on the plane effector, and we're going to build the scale as a direct part of the effector. So what we can do is under parameter, select scale. We're going to use the absolute transformation mode using a uniform and absolute scale, which is set to 0. And now we can already see with the orientation that we have a nice growth over time, or as we move this object through the scene. So since I wanted a reverse function, the camera being down here, I currently don't have a real camera in the scene, but the view over here, we actually want to go in the other direction. So we can go to the Falloff and invert it. And now we can see that we can control it in the other direction. Another thing we could do if we don't want to use invert is to set it up on the -z. One thing I do like about the invert is if we wanted to go outside of the Falloff range in the view, it does show up a little bit differently. But with the invert off, we can see the actual Falloff within the display. So we can adjust the size and basically our Z scale or Z size of the Falloff to adjust the scaling and how far away the object has to be for it to reach max scale. So that's a pretty quick and easy setup. And if we want to have a different modification per clone, so in other words, let's say we wanted to have the reeds or the small plant showing before the rest of these objects, we would then, there's a couple of ways to do that. I think in the case of this scene, with there being so few cloner objects, only having the 3 cloner objects, the easiest way would be to create an additional plane effector just for the reeds object. So we can copy and paste that plane effector, and now we're going to go to the plants object, go to the effectors list, remove the last plane effector, and add in the new one. So what we can do is take the one that is going to affect the plants and offset it to be however far ahead of the other one as we want. We could also, since it's a smaller object, reduce the Falloff amount so they grow very quickly. And moving both of these together, we can see that growth. If needed, go ahead and take the plants, bring it up a little further, maybe adjust the Falloff a little. So that's one way we could set it up to have the earlier growth. An additional setup would be to first create an effector that's going to modify the weight, and then have the weight set up before it reaches the effector and the plane effector. And then under the Falloff, we can choose to not use, or just to use the weight of the clones themselves. Now that would be something that needs to be done last in the list before the plane effector. At least in this setup. If we have a wind system, that's going to be the absolute last setup. So just managing the effector list that way. So we could do that for the other clone sets as well, if you wanted to have that variation. You could also use both setups and have a little more variation set up by modifying and using the weight once again, but using, say, a random effector to control the weight before the plane reaches it, but still on a per object basis or per clone basis. So a lot of different ways to control that and set that up. If you want to have any additional changes made to the clones, so that they may be twist into place or rotate into place, under the plane effector, we can turn on the rotation, and let's go ahead and make them tip upward. So we're going to use a -90 rotation or a -90 pitch, and now they will kind of pop up into place with a little rotation as well, kind of bending up. If you wanted to have a little bit of change for the heading, we could also set that up as well. Do 45 for both. So now they're going to twist and kind of rotate into place, as well as that bend. You might need to use a higher value for it to show. And if we set the transformation space for both of them to node, the individual rotation is going to be per instance, and we can see a really neat looking effect as they're coming up, where they're kind of spinning a bit. And then we can just limit that effect by changing the overall heading amount. So maybe setting it to 180 instead of 360 might look a little bit better. But still gives a nice flow to the way they're kind of popping into place. Now another thing is the larger trees are growing about the same speed as those smaller trees. So if we just want to have another plane effector just to affect the larger trees, we can set that up with maybe, in that case it would be a larger fall-off amount. So that way the scaling takes place over a longer period of time, and after the small trees are already grown, the larger trees would continue growing. We can set that up the same way we made the plant changes. Okay, now we're going to make the animated controller, which is currently not animated, but will be very shortly. I'm going to make it a little more efficient. Another thing I want to note is I do have it set up, of course where we set it up before, to have the two separate planes to move across, so that we have the smaller plants around the water showing up first. But I do want to note that we can change the orientation of these effectors as well to modify the timing. So in the case of the larger trees, because they are taller, as we start to tilt these effectors back, we can make them grow a little bit slower. So all of the taller objects and larger objects will take a little bit longer to show up. We can also modify the heading of this object so that we can come from a different angle if we wanted to. It doesn't have to be directly aligned with the terrain. So you can manipulate that pretty much however you want. And to make it a little bit easier to move, since I still want to move in the direction across the terrain, I'm going to add in a null object, which is going to be the control for the position of these other objects. So we're going to call this the growth controller. And one thing we could do is set up another object, maybe say a cube, and connect our Falloffs and things like that to that cube using Espresso. But I think in this case, just setting these up with a null object is going to be a little bit easier. So all we need to do is take these null objects and make them children of the growth controller. So now we can just move that across the scene. And we can also see that the larger trees are taking a little bit longer to grow now than the rest of the trees. And we still have the other objects set in front. There is another option as well under the Falloff, and that's the ability to offset. So if we wanted to duplicate and create the change as we did for just affecting the plants being a separate object, instead of even moving the object, we can adjust the Falloff amount or the offset and keep it in the same place if needed. But even having this offset allows us an additional option to animate an independent frame track, which is pretty nice. Lots of versatility. So now I'm going to go into these effectors and turn off the visibility option so that we can just use our growth controller. We're going to go to the display, and we can set something that's going to show up a little bit better. Right now, the null object is below the ground plane, so I'm going to take the children out and the effectors and raise this up so we can see it a lot better. And then move that back. And that way we have a nice little reference object that we can grab and control the animation with. So since these are children, we can manipulate the rotation and the position and animate them pretty easily. So let's go ahead and set up where the camera is going to be showing. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this just around the edge. And I do want it to be kind of close to where the plants are going to show, because there's another effector and technique I want to show for objects by the camera. So let's set this kind of over here. We'll have an area where the water starts to go around. And we got to figure out how quickly we want this to happen. Let's go ahead and set this up for 150 frames. And we want to, at frame 0, well, first what we're going to do is add a camera, set the view to the camera. I'm also going to go ahead and change my render setting. Let's go ahead, I'm going to set it pretty low right now to 800, and then set the film aspect to 1.777, which is 16 by 9. And we might as well add just some early level anti-aliasing just for the preview, so it looks slightly better. And it's also a good idea whenever you have your camera placed, especially if you're going to be doing sort of camera projections, that you create a keyframe for it immediately. Because you don't want to accidentally move the camera and lose any projections that you have. What you can also do is create a duplicate of the camera just by selecting the camera and then going to camera, and that can be kind of a backup. Let's go to the growth controller, and we're going to move it so there is no impact on the terrain, so just at the starting point. And I'm going to go ahead and add keyframe for the null. And then we're going to go to the end of the animation, frame 150, and pull that out so that we have full growth on everything, including the trees, and create a keyframe. What I also want to do is open up the attributes for these keyframes, and I'm going to be using a linear mode for both of them, and that way there's no ease in and out. It's just going to be a direct animation, so it's the same speed at start to finish, and it's not going to start out very slow and then increase in speed, and then it would slow down again towards the end. And that's what's going to happen if we stick with the spline. So here we can watch the animation and see everything growing, and that looks pretty good. Now, what I want to show you, and just for the sake of making this seem a little more useful, I'm going to move the camera just temporarily to a point where I know there's going to be a bunch of trees in the way. So I'm going to go ahead and key this camera. We still have the original position set. And set it to a point where basically there's a whole bunch of trees in the way. Actually, I'll set it right here. We're going to go back and just move it over a little. So this way there's a giant tree in the way. And what I want to do is set up, there's a couple of different ways we can do this. But basically we want something that's going to keep these objects from intersecting with the camera or showing up in front of the camera in this place where we just have this giant tree. Now granted, the actual clone we might end up using might look nice there, showing through the leaves, and if you wanted to have an animated tree, leaves growing separate from the rest of the cloners, even in that case, you might want to have just your own object placed and not even use the cloner for it. So what we're going to do, and this is also a great way to set up any sort of LOD effects, which is really important for separating distant objects which don't need a lot of polygons from the foreground elements, which should be nicer looking. So what I'm going to do is add in, starting with, we can just use a volume effector. And what I want to do is get out of the camera for the moment. We still have that other camera, which is really close to the other one. I'm going to grab the volume effector and move it close to the camera. I'm going to go ahead and switch to a different viewport so we can see that a little better. I'm just positioning that in the top view to be right by the camera. So now what we want to do is grab our volume emitter, or volume effector, and under the Falloff we're going to choose to use a sphere. So we also need to affect the other clones, and since I have 3 cloners, I'm just going to delete that for now, select the clones, and add in this volume effector, which means I also need to reposition it. So go ahead and grab that, move that back into position, and then set that to sphere. And what we want it to do is basically repel the clones away from the camera. And we can set the scale and size to match a little bit better, because we don't want it to be huge, we don't want to subtract too much, we just want a controllable value that can be easily set and changed. We could also basically make this a child of the camera to remove anything near the camera regardless of its position. So now we need to set up the effect. and what we're going to do is turn on visibility, which automatically removed pretty much all the objects we needed it to remove. Just making sure it doesn't remove anything else. In this case, it does look like it's because of the weights and some of the other setups, it's creating more smaller trees. So we might need to adjust the fall off. So we can adjust this inner control, which is going to be the fall off, or go to the fall off setting and just change it with the slider. If you want to invert, we can now populate or create clones right near the camera. So that's kind of the opposite effect. I'm going to go ahead and set the mode to linear. And as you can see, it is modifying which objects are showing. It might just be a refresh, because when I do make certain changes to the movement, those objects do disappear. So it looks like that's just more of a refresh error rather than a limitation. So that is the clone. So now let's go back to the camera. And you can see that those objects that were right in front of it before are now gone. We can adjust the fall off amount and see and really control which objects are going to be removed. So for the purpose of setting up, if you want to have still the option to have the animation all tied to the original effectors, but just use higher res objects, we can also duplicate the volume effector along with all of the additional clones, and then invert the volume for the duplicate, and then use the clones of the cloner objects to be higher res. So that way you kind of have you've got a separation to have really high res things near the camera and lower res away from the camera. So that's a really helpful setup. And like I said, if you want to take this and make it a child of the camera, we can now move the camera around and not really worry about anything ever being in the way no matter where it's at. So that's a really, really nice additional feature. The scene itself, depending on how many clones you have, how many polygons, if you just want to make a slight change to the camera and it's taking too long to process all of your effectors, you can temporarily just kind of turn off the volume for the camera, make your movement change, and then turn it back on. It does speed things up a little bit more. I'm going to choose to filter out the cameras from the scene in the view, and also choose the volume effector which is showing up in the viewport and just make it so it's not visible or interfering. And the other way we could set this up, although it does have a slightly different output and wouldn't be as useful for setting up the level of detail because you can't reverse it, is to use what's going to be the target effector. And once again, selecting all of our clones and our cloner objects and then adding it so that it adds it to the list, because we do want to impact everything. If we go to the target effector, select effector, it's currently set to an object target, which is just right now itself. So everything is kind of circling around towards the center, which is actually pretty neat because you can do some cool effects that way. But if we go back to the camera and set this to a look at camera, we can basically have everything facing at the camera. Whether or not we want to use the pitch, we can turn that on or off. But the repel option will also allow us to push things away from the camera. Now keep in mind that this is not removing them like the volume effector does, which I'll go ahead and turn off for the moment. What it's doing is pushing them down through the terrain underneath the object. And granted, we can get some neat effects out of this. So as the camera pushes through, we can sink objects down or raise them which is a kind of neat effect. The benefit definitely, though, of the volume effector is that it is removing the objects rather than just pushing them through the ground, which is a little easier on the scene, and not manipulating our objects beyond our controlled effectors or whatever we have animated. But this can be used for a lot of additional effects. So if we wanted to have a different kind of growth, we could automatically select it and set it up to the camera, so that as the camera moves, in this case backwards across the screen, everything kind of pops up around it. Even to have that as an additional added animation within the current animation, to start from the camera being on one end of the water and pushing back, so you could have the growth along with some added detailed growth with this effector. There's a lot of other options for this too, which can create some pretty neat effects. The next node target, which is going to target the node right next to it, previous node, and that's really based on the creation of each one. That can add a nice little bit to the animation. The only problem is, in this case, what is happening, let me turn off the repel, is all the objects will be kept straight up. So whether or not we have the pitch settings used, we still don't have the animation that was set up before for the objects kind of rotating and popping up into place. But that is available. It's also useful for billboards, if you're going to be using billboards.